Alaska, home to its breathtaking beauty, native culture, fish, snow, and of course, crude oil. In less than 30 years, Alaska went from a fishing state exporting mainly salmon to producing over 20% of the United States oil at its peak in 1988. Today, the industry accounts for a quarter of Alaska's jobs, over half of the state's economy, and brings in so much money that the state doesn't even need to tax its citizens. But this is an industry in decline. Whether it's environmental catastrophe, local opposition, or government policy, Alaska went from America's largest oil-producing state to making less than 4% of the nation's oil today. So, how did Alaska's oil industry grow so fast so quickly, and why is it in decline? This is the rise and fall of Alaska's oil industry. Now, if you're wondering how this became part of this, it's because in 1867, fears of British occupation, amongst other things, led to Russia selling their colony of Alaska to the United States for just $7.2 million. But nobody really knew the extent of Alaska's hydrocarbon reserves until its first big discovery in 1957. This discovery has been credited as helping the region gain an economic foundation large enough to justify giving Alaska its statehood. And 2 years later, in 1959, Alaska became the 49th state of America. But this was just the beginning for Alaska's oil industry. After 1957, a flurry of global oil companies flocked to Alaska in search of oil and gas. And in 1964, the state leased out the first package of land in a region that would later become one of the key economic areas in the entire state. A region known as the North Slope. Now, the North Slope became home to 6 of the top 100 largest oil fields in the United States, including the Kuparuk River, Endicott Island, and the largest oil fields in North America, Prudhoe Bay. Once the fields were set up and the taps were turned on, the state was bringing in revenue like never before. Average wages went from $7,000 in 1960 to over $30,000 in the mid-80s. Alaska's population tripled from 200 to 600,000, whilst the state budget soared from less than $50 million per year in the early 60s to over $3 billion. Refineries and the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, which transported over 2 million barrels of oil per day at its peak, were heavily relied on by Canada and the rest of the US, as this was a time where America's oil production had been stagnating for a while. At a certain point in time, Alaskan oil probably powered 1 in 4 cars in US states like California and Washington in the 80s and 90s. So Alaska was riding high. And just as nothing could stop this growth, it all came to a screeching halt.
An oil tanker ran aground today off the nation's northernmost ice-free port, Valdez, Alaska.
The Exxon Valdez oil spill was one of the worst environmental disasters in US history, and marked the beginning of a long decline for Alaska's oil industry. Following this environmental catastrophe, there was a rise in anti-oil and gas sentiment from local populations and environmental groups across the country. While stricter environmental regulations and protections on lands like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge made it much more expensive for energy companies to operate in the region. But a fundamental reason for the decline in Alaskan oil is simply that cheaper options exist elsewhere. The rise of low-cost shale oil developments in the south has meant that more energy companies simply aren't taking the risk of the higher cost drilling associated with the Arctic, where break-even costs can be as high as $70 to $80 per barrel. Several banks are no longer loaning money to energy companies who operate in the Arctic, further increasing the cost of capital for these companies. So more and more energy companies are simply leaving Alaska altogether. Now, Alaska produces less than a quarter of what they did in 1988 and supplies an insignificant 4% of US supply. So, whilst controversial ventures like the Willow Project have been approved for now, it's unlikely that Alaska is ever going to see companies flock to it as they did in the past. So whilst Alaska continues to navigate these changing tides, the legacy of its oil industry will continue to play a crucial role in shaping the future of the state. But it's likely that the industry will remain just that, something of a legacy.